Hey folks, welcome to Deep Dive Dispatch, the podcast where we don't just scratch the surface. We dig deep into the political landscapes that shape our world today. I'm excited to introduce your guides on this journey through history and headlines, John Matthews and his insightful co-host, Sarah Collins. Together, they'll peel back the layers of complex political issues, offering a slightly conservative viewpoint while staying rooted in facts and historical context. So, buckle up for a thought-provoking ride as we dive into the stories behind the stories. This is Deep Dive Dispatch. Let's get started.
Welcome to Deep Dive. Today we're going to be diving into a topic that's constantly making headlines and sparking heated debate: gun control. Specifically, to explore this issue from a conservative perspective.
And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. You know, we're not just skimming the surface. We're really going to be going deep using the sources provided, articles, research papers, historical documents, really going to try to understand the nuances of this very complex issue.
Yeah, for sure. When I was going through the material, one thing really jumped out at me. It's defensive gun use, or what they call DGU.
Right.
It's something you rarely hear about in the mainstream media, which often just focuses on, the tragedies of gun violence.
Yeah, that's a really crucial observation. One of the sources that you provided, an article titled Defensive Gun Use Statistics, America's Life-Saving Gun Incidents 2024. It's packed with real-life examples of DGU. It showcases how often guns are actually used to prevent crimes and protect lives. And so it's fascinating to me how often this reality is just overlooked.
Right. And it's not just anecdotal evidence. Like, we actually have research to back this up. Gary Kleck, a criminologist who has studied gun violence extensively, found that defensive gun use is way more common than official statistics would suggest. His work, using CDC survey data, suggests that there may be millions of DGUs every year. That's a lot.
Yeah, that's a huge number. And Kleck's research is really interesting because it highlights some limitations of these traditional crime surveys, like the National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS. While it's a very valuable survey, it likely underestimates DGU for several reasons.
I can imagine, people might be hesitant to report using a gun, especially if they're, afraid of any legal repercussions.
Right.
Imagine you're filling out a government survey, and you're asked about this potentially sensitive situation where you used a firearm. You might not be totally forthcoming.
Exactly. There's this natural reluctance, I think, to disclose information that could be used against you, especially when it comes to something as politically charged as gun use. Plus, the NCVS doesn't directly ask about defensive gun use. It asks broader questions about victimization.
Oh, okay.
Which means people might not even think to mention a DGU incident.
So we're potentially missing a huge chunk of the story.
Right.
When it comes to how guns are actually used in self-defense.
Absolutely. And Kleck points out another layer of complexity here: the CDC itself. Because of the agency's historical association with gun control advocacy, some gun owners might be wary of participating in their surveys.
Yeah, I see.
Which, that could further skew the data.
So it's like we're looking at a puzzle, but with missing pieces.
Yeah.
And without those pieces, it's really difficult to get a complete picture of gun violence and the role of firearms in society.
Yeah, it's a puzzle, but it's also really interesting, right? Because it opens up all these questions about, how do we get a more accurate picture? How do we account for these biases? And that's something that I think, as researchers, we always have to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's another source that you provided that I thought was really interesting as well, which is this article, A Defensive Firearms Use is Common. It cites a survey that was conducted in England, and it found that even the visible presence of a firearm can deter crime.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this reinforces the idea that DGU isn't always about firing a shot, right? It's about deterring a threat, often without any violence at all.
Right, and that brings up another really important point: the historical context of the Second Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can't really understand the current gun control debate without understanding why the Founding Fathers actually enshrined the right to bear arms in the Constitution.
Absolutely. The Second Amendment was born out of this deep distrust of government tyranny and a belief that an armed citizenry was essential for liberty. Remember, the Founding Fathers had just fought a revolution to free themselves from oppressive rule. They understood the importance of self-defense, both individually and collectively.
And this idea of self-reliance, community defense.
Yeah.
I mean, that was particularly relevant in the context of westward expansion and, just the challenges of frontier life. Firearms weren't just for hunting. They were for protection against, wild animals, hostile Native American tribes, even criminals.
You're absolutely right. And this source, Second Amendment, A Complete History of the Right to Bear Arms that you sent, it really dives into that. It explains how firearms were seen as necessities for survival in early America. It wasn't just about personal freedom. It was about protecting yourself, your family, your community from threats, as you said.
Right. But, as America evolved, so too did the interpretation of the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
After the Civil War, there was a shift to, focusing on protecting the rights of newly freed slaves.
Yeah.
Including their right to bear arms for self-defense.
Right. And the 14th Amendment, which was intended to guarantee equal rights for all citizens, that included the right to keep and bear arms. And it's really interesting because this brings us to, I think, a really dark chapter in American history, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and their attempts to disarm African Americans during the Reconstruction era. This source on the Ku Klux Klan and the Reconstruction era, it's a stark reminder of how gun control can actually be used as a tool of oppression.
It's kind of chilling to read about how the KKK used violence and intimidation to disarm Black communities, which effectively stripped them of their ability to protect themselves. This historical context really sheds light on why gun ownership is so deeply intertwined with the fight for civil rights.
Absolutely, and especially for Black Americans. And it's directly relevant to one of the earliest Supreme Court cases that dealt with the Second Amendment, United States versus Cruikshank. This case, it stemmed from this horrific Colfax massacre in 1873.
Oh, yeah.
Where a white militia just murdered over 150 Black people in Louisiana. And it shows how legal interpretations can have really devastating consequences.
I mean, the Supreme Court's ruling in Cruikshank basically said that the Second Amendment only restricted the federal government, not state governments. And that, that obviously left Black communities vulnerable to state-sanctioned violence and these disarmament efforts. It just highlights the potential for gun control to be used in really discriminatory ways.
Absolutely. And it reminds us, I think, that the gun control debate isn't just about abstract principles. It's about real-world impacts, power dynamics, this historical legacy of discrimination. And it forces us to ask these difficult questions, like how do we ensure that gun control measures don't inadvertently harm the very communities that they're intended to protect?
It's fascinating, isn't it? These historical examples, how they really highlight these complexities of the issue, the importance of understanding the nuances.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, it seems like understanding the role of defensive gun use is like a key part of this conversation and one that is often overlooked.
You're absolutely right. And that's what we're going to pick up when we return for the second part of our deep dive. We'll delve further into the data on defensive gun use, and we'll explore how this concept really challenges conventional narratives about gun violence.
Looking forward to it.
Hey everyone, just taking a moment to send a huge shout out to all of you tuning in to Deep Dive Dispatch. Your support really keeps us going, and if you're enjoying the deep dives and want to help us continue bringing you these thought-provoking discussions, head over to deepdivedispatch.com. It's an awesome way to support the show and keep the conversation alive. Big thanks for being part of our community. Now, let's jump back into the next part of our episode and keep unraveling these intriguing topics. Enjoy.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the gun control debate.
We've been exploring the historical context of the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
And how it's been intertwined with issues of self-defense and civil rights.
Right.
Particularly for Black Americans.
And one thing that keeps coming up is this idea of defensive gun use.
Right.
How often guns are used to prevent crime, which seems to be a perspective that's often missing from, the mainstream narrative.
Yeah, you're right. It's a perspective that challenges this common perception that more guns automatically equals more crime.
Yeah.
And the sources that you provided actually offer some compelling evidence to support this.
For instance, the fact sheet, Gun Violence from the Heritage Foundation. It shows that despite what we often hear in the media, violent crime and gun-related crime have actually been on the decline in the U.S.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. We tend to focus on the sensationalized stories, the mass shootings that understandably grab headlines.
Yeah.
But the overall trend, as this data shows, is actually moving towards less violence.
And it's important to remember, too, that the vast majority of gun crimes are committed with illegally obtained firearms, not legally owned ones. So is stricter gun control really targeting the root of the problem?
That's a question that deserves serious consideration.
Yeah.
The Heritage Foundation source brings up some interesting examples that challenge the assumption that stricter gun control equals less crime.
Okay.
Take states like New Hampshire and Vermont, for example.
Okay, yeah.
They have relatively permissive gun laws, yet their homicide rates are among the lowest in the nation.
So interesting. Which contrasts sharply with cities like Chicago, which have very strict gun control laws, but they continue to struggle with high homicide rates. The Blue City Murder Problem article really digs into this phenomenon.
And it raises some thought-provoking questions about the effectiveness of certain types of gun control measures.
Yeah.
It seems that simply restricting legal access to firearms doesn't always translate to a reduction in crime,
Okay.
especially when you consider that criminals, by definition, don't obey the law.
What about right-to-carry laws?
Right.
Those seem to be a particularly hot-button issue in the gun control debate.
They are, and the research on their impact is mixed.
Okay.
Some studies suggest that allowing law-abiding citizens to carry concealed weapons can actually deter crime,
Right.
as criminals are less likely to target someone they believe might be armed.
So the logic is, if a criminal doesn't know who's carrying a gun, they're less likely to take the risk.
Exactly. But other studies show no significant effect or even an increase in crime. It's a complex issue with many variables,
Yeah.
and the research is far from conclusive.
This reminds me of something else I found interesting. The Defensive Gun Use Statistics article mentioned how even the visible presence of a firearm can deter crime. Like that story about the store owner who just casually had a handgun on their hip and this rowdy customer immediately backed down.
It's a fascinating point, and it reinforces the idea that defensive gun use isn't always about pulling the trigger.
Right.
It's often about deterring a threat before it escalates to violence.
Exactly.
And that deterrence factor is something we really need to consider when we talk about gun control.
It definitely challenges the notion that more guns automatically equals more violence. It suggests that in some cases, the presence of a firearm can actually prevent violence from happening.
And that brings us back to the importance of accurately measuring defensive gun use,
Right.
which, as we discussed earlier, is notoriously difficult to do.
Right. If we're not even capturing the full extent of DGU, how can we have an honest and informed debate about gun control?
Exactly, and that's why Gary Kleck's research is so significant.
Right.
He's not just providing anecdotal evidence.
Right.
He's using statistical analysis to show that DGU is likely far more common than official statistics suggest.
And his work highlights a really crucial point. The way we collect data on gun violence
Right.
can have a huge impact on how we perceive the issue
Absolutely.
and ultimately on the policies we enact.
Well said. And this ties into another area where data can be misleading, the way we categorize gun deaths.
You're talking about separating suicides from homicides, right?
Yes.
When analyzing gun death statistics.
Yes.
That was something I found particularly insightful in the Pew Research Center data.
It's absolutely crucial to make that distinction.
Yeah.
Often when we hear statistics about gun deaths, they lump suicides and homicides together.
Right, yeah.
But those are two very different phenomena with different causes and requiring different solutions.
And the Pew data shows that while the raw number of gun murders has increased in recent years, the gun murder rate is actually below its peak in the 1970s.
Which means that statistically speaking, we're actually living in a less violent time,
Wow.
at least when it comes to gun homicides.
Okay.
But what has been rising steadily is the gun suicide rate.
Which suggests that if we're serious about reducing gun deaths, we need to address the mental health crisis
Right.
and focus on suicide prevention strategies,
Yeah.
not just gun control.
Precisely. Focusing solely on restricting access to firearms might miss a huge part of the problem
Right.
when it comes to gun deaths. We need a more nuanced approach
Yeah.
that takes into account the full complexity of this issue.
I'm starting to see how this debate is so much more nuanced than it's often portrayed in the media. It's not just about guns.
Right.
It's about mental health, personal responsibility, individual rights,
Absolutely.
and the role of government.
You're getting it.
Yeah.
And that brings us to another often misunderstood aspect of this debate, the role of the National Rifle Association, or NRA.
Ah, the NRA. The Negroes with Guns source you provided was really eye-opening.
Yeah.
It challenges the common portrayal of the NRA as a monolithic, inherently racist organization.
Yeah, this source argues that the NRA has a history of opposing laws
Yeah.
that were specifically designed to disarm African Americans.
Interesting.
Laws that were often rooted in racist motivations
Okay.
and aimed at controlling Black communities.
Which means that in those historical instances, the NRA's stance was actually aligned with protecting the Second Amendment rights of Black citizens.
Right. And this forces us to consider the nuances of the NRA's history, particularly in the context of racial dynamics and gun control. It's a reminder that things are rarely black and white.
Right.
And that even organizations with complex histories can play a role in both advancing and hindering civil rights.
Yeah. And it highlights the importance of looking beyond these, like, simplistic narratives.
Absolutely.
And really understanding the historical context of an issue.
Exactly. And that brings us to the modern interpretation of the Second Amendment, which has undergone significant shifts in recent decades.
Yeah, we have some legal sources here
Okay.
that shed light on how the Supreme Court's understanding of this right has evolved over time. Second Amendment interpretations and historical background of the Second Amendment, they really delve into this evolution.
Two landmark cases stand out.
No.
District of Columbia v. Heller in 2008 and McDonald v. Chicago in 2010.
Yeah.
These rulings fundamentally changed the legal landscape
Right.
by affirming that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess a firearm for self-defense in the home.
And McDonald v. Chicago extended that right to apply to state and local governments as well.
Right.
Meaning states can't just enact whatever gun control measures they want.
Right.
The Second Amendment sets a national standard.
Which has led to a wave of legal challenges to existing gun control laws across the country. And then in 2022, the Supreme Court went even further with New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin.
Oh, wow.
This case struck down a New York law that required people to show proper cause to carry a concealed handgun outside the home.
So now the right to bear arms isn't just about having a gun in your house. It's also about the right to carry a firearm for self-defense in public.
And this has been a major victory for gun rights advocates who see it as an affirmation that the Second Amendment protects this fundamental right that extends beyond the home.
It seems like we're in a period of significant legal and political flux when it comes to gun control. What do you think the future holds for this debate?
It's hard to say for sure, but one thing's clear. The debate is far from settled.
Yeah.
These recent Supreme Court rulings have emboldened gun rights supporters, and they've led to a pushback against stricter gun control measures.
Right.
We're likely to see more legal challenges to existing laws.
I can imagine.
And the interpretation of the Second Amendment will continue to be fiercely contested.
It's a fascinating and complex issue, and one that we need to approach with nuance and a willingness to consider diverse perspectives.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this second part of our deep dive, I want to emphasize that the goal isn't to arrive at definitive answers.
Right.
It's to explore the complexities of this issue, to challenge our own assumptions, and to gain a deeper understanding of the various perspectives at play.
And that's what's so great about these deep dives. We're not just skimming the surface.
Right.
We're really getting into the weeds, exploring the history, the data, the legal precedents, and the human stories that shape this debate.
Exactly. And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll bring all of this together, exploring some of the key takeaways and considering what this all means for the future of gun control in America.
Hey everyone, just taking a moment to send a huge shout out to all of you tuning in to Deep Dive Dispatch. Your support really keeps us going. And if you're enjoying the deep dives and want to help us continue bringing you these thought-provoking discussions, head over to deepdivedispatch.com. It's an awesome way to support the show and keep the conversation alive. Big thanks for being part of our community. Now, let's jump back into the next part of our episode and keep unraveling these intriguing topics. Enjoy.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the gun control debate.
It's been quite a journey exploring this complex and often contentious issue, hasn't it?
It really has. We've covered a lot of ground, from the historical context of the Second Amendment
Right.
to the latest Supreme Court rulings and everything in between.
And I think one of the key takeaways, at least for me, is just how nuanced this debate really is. It's not a simple issue with easy answers.
Right.
You know, there are so many factors to consider, from individual rights to public safety, from historical legacies to these contemporary challenges that we face.
Yeah, one thing that really struck me was this connection between gun ownership and the fight for civil rights, especially for Black Americans.
Yeah.
I mean, the historical examples we discussed, like the Ku Klux Klan's efforts to disarm Black communities
Right.
and the rise of armed resistance during the Civil Rights Movement, it really highlighted this connection.
It's a powerful reminder that for many marginalized communities, the right to bear arms has been and continues to be a matter of survival and self-preservation.
Absolutely.
It's about the ability to protect oneself and one's community when those in power fail to do so.
Which challenges us to think critically about gun control measures and their potential impact on vulnerable communities. How do we balance the need for public safety with the right to self-defense, especially for those who have historically been denied that right?
It's a tough question, and one that doesn't have an easy answer,
Yeah.
but it's a question we need to grapple with honestly and thoughtfully.
And it ties into another theme that kind of emerged from our deep dive, the importance of data and how it's interpreted.
Right.
We saw how crime statistics can be misleading, how defensive gun use is often underreported, and how separating suicides from homicides paints a very different picture of gun violence in America.
The way we frame the data, the questions we ask, the categories we use, all of that can have a profound impact on how we perceive the issue and ultimately on the policies we support.
It's a reminder to be critical consumers of information,
Yeah.
to look beyond the headlines and sound bites, and to really seek out different perspectives.
And that brings us to, I think, the heart of the matter here, the Second Amendment itself. As we explored, this amendment was born out of this deep fear of government tyranny and a belief that an armed citizenry was essential to safeguard liberty.
The Founding Fathers, they understood that power can be abused, and that the people need a means to defend themselves, not just from criminals, but from a potentially oppressive government.
Right. And that idea, while it was rooted in 18th century America, it still resonates today. Many people, particularly those who hold a more conservative worldview, they see the Second Amendment as this bulwark against government overreach, as a safeguard against the erosion of individual liberties.
Which is why this debate is so passionate and often so divisive. It's not just about guns, it's about fundamental values, about the role of government, about this balance between individual rights and collective safety.
And as we conclude our deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. The gun control debate is not going away anytime soon.
Right.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers, and it's one that we as citizens need to engage with thoughtfully and respectfully.
We need to listen to each other, understand the different perspectives, consider the historical context, and base our opinions on evidence and reason.
Exactly.
Not fear and rhetoric.
Remember, this deep dive was just a starting point.
Yeah.
We encourage you to continue exploring this issue, to delve deeper into the sources that we discuss, and to seek out new information and viewpoints.
Because ultimately, the goal isn't to win the debate.
Right.
It's to have a more informed and nuanced conversation, one that leads to better understanding and, hopefully, to policies that address the root causes of gun violence while respecting individual rights.
Well said, and thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope it's given you a new perspective on the gun control debate and inspired you to continue learning and engaging with this important issue.
Until next time, keep asking questions, keep seeking answers, and keep the conversation going.
Hey folks, thanks for tuning in to Deep Dive Dispatch. We hope you found today's episode enlightening and packed full of insight. Remember, your support keeps us diving deep into the stories that matter. So if you enjoyed the show, make sure to download and share it with others who crave a deeper understanding of politics and history. And don't forget, we want to hear from you. If there's a topic out there that you think deserves a deep dive, reach out and let us know. Your input helps us bring you the most compelling content week after week. Stay curious, stay informed, and we'll catch you next time on Deep Dive Dispatch. Keep exploring, folks.